Hello and welcome to Need to Know, your weekly investment podcast brought to you by the experts at Coutts. I'm Sarah Muir and I'm joined as always by David Broomfield, plus special guest this week, Coutts US equity expert Howard Sparks. Welcome back to Need to Know, Howard. How are you?
Very well, thank you, Sarah. Thanks for having me back.
You're very welcome. And hello, David. How are you?
I'm well rested, thanks, Sarah. You gave me a week off last week chatting to Kitty.
We did, talking about prime and super prime property in London and how that market is faring up, especially in the light of changes to res non-dom rules and stamp duty and things like that. It was, though I say it myself, I think it was quite good fun.
It's an excellent listen. Anyone that hasn't listened should go and listen to it.
Thank you very much. So today I'm coming to the quickfire numbers round. I haven't forgotten that, but we are going to be talking about interactive entertainment today from an investment perspective. How large the sector is, what's the outlook for the sector, and how might developments in AI as well as changes to tariffs impact the sector. But I suppose we should, and I think this might be a topic for some of our quickfire numbers, we should probably explain what we mean by interactive entertainment. Simple terms, I would say it's computer games, but there's a little bit more to it than that. But essentially,
you're making us sound old. You're making us sound old.
Yeah, well, we are.
I think I prefer the definition that it's where users actively participate and influence the outcome.
Yes, that's I like that. That's a good one. Howard, have you got anything to add to that as a definition for interactive entertainment?
No, let's go with that.
Okay, I appreciate we all in danger of sounding like high court judges. I'm just trying to understand what pop music is if we're not careful. Okay, so before we get to those main sort of topics, then. Quickfire numbers round. Howard, let's come to you first. What is your quickfire number? Don't tell us what it is. Just tell us a number and we'll see if we can guess it.
I'm going to say 2.6 billion.
Ooh, 2.6 billion. No idea. David, any ideas?
It's a population number, or knowing Howard, it reflects something to do with the Mag 7 and a figure.
Okay, go on then. Howard, puts out of our misery.
Well, I've taken this number from Bank of America, who've estimated this is the estimated number of people playing games, video games, or what we call it?
Interactive entertainment.
Interactive entertainment. There we go.
Okay. 2.6 billion.
Yeah. So to put that into perspective, back in 95, that number was estimated to be about 100 million.
Wow. Okay. So that's a fairly rapid growth. That
kind of points to the amount of growth that we've seen in this industry in terms of users.
Okay. All right then. David, what's your number?
What is in a similar vein, and maybe you can guess it. Well, I'll be surprised if you can guess it. 500,000.
No idea.
Is the number of people who are still to this day playing something called Second Life. And if you're as old as I am, you will remember what a splash this made in 2003. Second Life is this virtual environment created by Linden Labs where users could interact with other users in this virtual world. Okay, and it's clunky and it's dated and it's now been technologically surpassed by a whole host of other kind of VR type environments, but there are still 500,000 people playing it. And when I went into the data, I think it's incredible. There's 14 people that are creators within this environment who earned over $1 million of real money by participating as an economic agent within this virtual world. And it's really fascinating. I could go right down the rabbit hole before we even get going on this.
Yeah, we only got 30 minutes, David. So.
And it just shows you that some of these games have real economies that are still running, and they have devoted players. And as I said, Second Life is clunky, but to get rid of it and upgrade it is sort of analogous to knocking down a Tudor house to build a block of flats. Okay, that sounds good, but this is a home to people. Literally, they love it. They absolutely love it. It's amazing. Okay. What's your number? Come on.
My number is 19,000.
No idea.
That is the number of games that were released in 2024 via Steam, which is a digital distribution platform. And the trouble is that gamers are basically, they can't keep up with the number of games being released because they're often playing games that are maybe 5 or 6 years old. They're still playing those games. They can't get around to all the new games. And we've already had more than 700 games released just in January of 2025. So there's a huge volume of games being released.
So the big test here is which of our speakers regularly play games? Now, I'll put my hand up, full disclosure, I do. I play a number of indie and niche games, and I like big strategy games, but I'm so time constrained that it tends to be when I'm on annual leave or Christmas, times like that. Do you? And Howard, do you?
I don't. I haven't played games since Pac-Man or Space Invaders were in arcades.
Well, I guess we have to talk about games. I mean, you talked about these big immersive kind of games. I'm very much towards the other end of the scale, so I'm much more Fruit Merge on the Elizabeth line, to be honest.
Candy Crush.
Well, here I think before we even get going, I should have used this as my statistic. I am reliably informed that 7 out of 10 subscribers to the New York Times subscribe simply to play the games on the New York Times platform. And they have a number of word games and a number of problem-solving games, and 7 out of 10. So to look at the New York Times as a news organization, I think betrays actually its user base. So I think this is something that is permeating businesses and platforms at all levels.
Okay, all right then. Well, let's talk about then the sector. David, Howard, let's start with you. How big is this sector? Who are some of the, I mean, I'm sure we might come to this thinking, I don't know much about interactive entertainment, but we probably do know most of the big players, don't we, in this sector? How, I guess for me, what's interesting is how does it compare to perhaps other more conventional entertainment sectors?
Well, it's kind of quite difficult to measure. There aren't, in a lot of our industries, you get very dominant players in areas like tech but I think with this industry, it's so fragmented. When consoles were first released in the early 70s, it's the console maker who used to make the games, and then that developed to independent publishers making the games. But now we've still got the console makers. Microsoft own Xbox, Sony, Nintendo. Then we have the content publishers. So I'm sure your listeners will know a lot of these names of EA, Activision, Take-Two, for example. But then also, and you mentioned them earlier, also now you have platforms which host games that players can either design, play, or watch others play. So platforms like Roblox, Twitch, and Stream. And then you also have what I guess are called storefronts. So where you would go to purchase games. So GameStop, I'm sure we've talked about that in the past. Google Play, the Apple App Store, Xbox Live, and then the other kind of area is in terms of the hardware. So gaming PCs are very different from normal PCs, and Nvidia before the AI euphoria really took hold was probably best known for its chips used in gaming PCs. And then going on even further, there's what's called engines. So those content publishers that I mentioned, rather than having to kind of create a new world from scratch or new framework from scratch, then often they'll buy that or license those from third parties. So these engines, you have these companies who design who have engines for content publishers to use. So really, it's incredibly fragmented. It's very difficult to kind of describe, well, how big is it? David?
I think Howard's absolutely right. I mean, it's very fragmented and it's incredibly fast changing. One of the points that you touch on, Howard, about consoles, I think is really interesting, because if you look at the composition of the market, about half of the market is actually now mobile gaming. And then consoles themselves are around just under a third of the market, with PC gaming basically making up the rest. So, that's shifted massively over the last couple of decades, obviously, as mobile gaming has come to the fore. But I think the way that I think about the relative size of this industry is comparing it to sort of more traditional forms of entertainment. So if you compare it to, say, the movie industry as an example, I think a lot of listeners might be surprised to find out just how big some of these games are, and the production costs of them, the development costs of them. I mean, there's different ways you can look at it. You can look at it over the lifetime earnings of, say, a game. And many of the games' lifetime's earnings are much greater than the movie equivalents, because people tend to play computer games years perhaps after they were released. But I did a little exercise over the last couple of days of just looking at when games were released and then looked at an equivalent movie in the same year. Okay. And you come up with some really interesting stats, I think. So if you look at some of the, I'm at the end of this game spectrum now. I'm away from the sort of indie games and those huge number of games that you mentioned, Sarah, that are released. I'm talking about the big blockbuster games that are released every year. So if you look at, I took 2013 and 2018 as an example. So I think 2018 is really good. You had Red Dead Redemption, which was a massive game, released by Rockstar. It had about 170 million development cost. It has revenue of about 3.5 billion. And you compare that to Avengers Infinity War, one of the biggest movies of all time, released in 2018, had a revenue only of 2.1 billion and had a development cost of 325 million. So, I mean, these games are in many respects more successful than some of the most successful movies. And the production costs and the volume of people this industry employs is just absolutely enormous. So it's very fragmented, though. I mean, I'm talking here about the big blockbuster studios, but then you've got this huge long tail of indie games and niche games as well.
So is it fair then to compare it to the movie industry from a point of view, if you're trying to have a benchmark of how big the sector is and how well it's performing, that's the thing it's closest to, I guess?
Well, I think parts of it are. I think those big blockbuster games are, but I don't think, niche sort of mobile games or indie games you can necessarily compare. I don't know. I mean, a lot of this is quite subjective. I think from an investor point of view, though, you would look at the sort of key metrics. You look at try and gauge the profitability of the product, whether it's a movie or whether it's a game. And some games over their lifetime are just incredibly profitable in that respect. And I think how the barriers to entry are dropping and how this sort of console wars narrative is playing out. I mean, how I mentioned Xbox, Sony, and Nintendo. There's now very different approaches emerging between, well, certainly two of those firms and Nintendo, with allowing cross-platform releases and just trying to get the distribution more widespread, and people allowing different ecosystems to cross-pollinate.
Yeah, certainly. Talking about your point about revenue, I looked at the most successful game, if you adjust revenue for inflation, is Space Invaders, that was launched in 1978, has $30 billion of revenue. And I think the second one is like Pac-Man or something. So that's to say, it's adjusted for inflation, but it just shows the shelf life. I mean, a film released in 1978 is still not going to be generating that kind of revenue. But I guess my other point before I come to you, Howard, is so much of the success of the big companies is dependent on their big sort of high profile, the big sort of important games, whether it's, I don't know, Grand Theft Auto or Assassin's Creed or whatever it might be. And because if you look at something like, I don't know, I was looking at interactive entertainment versus Take-Two, and one, interactive entertainment, their value is quite low at the moment, I think, because their football game has not done so well, whereas Take-Two Interactive, that produces Grand Theft Auto, they've got a phenomenal, I mean, very expensive if you go on forward earnings. So I guess, Howard, from an investor's point of view, how do you look at these different companies and assess them? I mean, obviously we've got things like earnings per share, forward earnings, but is this a sector that you approach? It sounds like you're going to approach this with a degree of trepidation because, as you say, there are so many, it's so fragmented, and I guess it's very, very fast moving as well.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, in terms of, well, when we're looking at direct equities for consideration in Coutts investment portfolios, we tend to use a checklist So we tend to look at areas that are common to all companies. So, we look at their management, we look at their shareholders' ownership, we look at the financial statements, look at the ESG, look at various controversies. But also we look at industry dynamics. And I think that is what's really difficult about this industry, or makes it much more difficult to identify kind of clear winners. Now, you mentioned the franchises. So these big gaming franchises of Grand Theft Auto, Call of Duty, EA Sports. Now, for so many years, these publishers were able to just roll out another one. And it's now getting to the stage where I guess the question is, well, for how much longer can they do this? How much longer, particularly with the games pricing? How much will users continue to spend, continue to upgrade? Now, in terms of, just before I let David in, I mean, the challenge that they've got is, how do they do this? And they've got huge costs in terms of there's a battle to make these games much more cinematic, which increases costs. And as a result, there is a great deal of uncertainty about, will these franchises survive in their current form?
Just before you jump in, David, I saw an interesting stat that in 2023, 61% of playing time spent on games was on games that were 6 years or older.
Wow, that's it's a great stat. I think when we come back to Howard's point on costs, I think AI, we'll get into that, I think, in our final section about the impact of AI, because I think that's some of the answer here. But I want to dwell on a little point about how risky this is as a business venture, because there's a great example from last year, actually. If you look at Sony's launch of a game called Concord, which I wouldn't be surprised if none of you have heard of, because it was canned after 2 weeks, 2 weeks after launch, due to just lack of interest. Sony spent $100 million on this game, and it was a monumental failure because it competed in a very crowded space with 2 other games, and in those other more successful games, players just stuck with the game they had and they loved. This game brought nothing new to that part of the market. It was a full-priced release. So to Howard's point, it was expensive, basically expensive to play a game that I'm already playing elsewhere. And if you contrast that with the other case study that I was looking at, which was a game called Marvel Rivals, which unsurprisingly is related to this Marvel Cinematic Universe. It had familiar IP, familiar characters, but it had a different model. It didn't have this full pay model. It had this free-to-play model. So it basically eliminates the barriers to entry. And it got this massive, strong engagement, and it was a much cheaper game to produce. So I think, even with game companies who are experts in their field, the customer demand and the market is moving at such a pace that by the time you launch these giant games, you have to be sure you've got the market to launch them into. And as Howard said, the costs are absolutely enormous. And I think I gave some examples when I was comparing some of these big grand narratives, Red Dead Redemption, Grand Theft Auto, obviously by Rockstar, part of the same studio. They are hundreds of millions of dollars to create.
Okay, so we're saying the sector then is, obviously there's huge amounts of revenue to be generated. It is a massive sector, but it is very fragmented. It's very fast moving. From an investment point of view, it's quite challenging because you've got so many different players in the market, and it's and obviously we've talked about, we've thrown lots of numbers out here. We've got a huge number of games being released, and it seems to be that it's a challenge sometimes with a new release to get that take up that you're looking for if it's going to be really successful, because there's so much to be invested in these games, because the expectations of quality are, as you say, I think Howard, you said cinematic now. People expect really, really high levels of quality. So I guess, how do we see, if we sort of take a step back without talking about specific companies necessarily, but how do we see perhaps this sector developing? And perhaps then let's bring in that final point, which is, and how do we see AI impacting the development of games? It's possibly going to make it cheaper to develop games, but also, I mean, there's lots of talk of tariffs at the moment, and we've had more tariffs introduced this week. is that going to have a part? How much of this is sort of cross-border collaboration on development of games? And also, is there, because at the moment the sector is pretty much unregulated, so could we see regulation in the sector, and will that impact how well companies do? But also, I mean, whether wider deregulation, that's one of the policies that the new president in the US has talked about, how that could impact the sector. Howard, do you want to say something?
Yeah, well, before we get into the other areas, I mean, you're right in saying that historically the sector has been largely unregulated, but we are seeing increased involvement in from regulators. Listeners will remember the UK CMA being involved in trying to block the Microsoft Activision merger, and then also, meanwhile, the app stores, Apple App Store and Google Play, are coming under increasing scrutiny from many regional regulators about whether these kind of walled gardens, if you like, whether that is anti-competitive. So I don't think we certainly shouldn't dismiss the threat of regulation, because I think that's likely to continue to be a factor in the future of this industry.
Yeah, I think that the point that Howard touched on there about these closed wall gardens or these closed ecosystems is really important, because there is this evolving stance on platform exclusivity. And I actually don't think the regulator probably needs to break that up. I think consumer behavior is going to break that up. And Microsoft's leading the charge in terms of the big firms pushing away from platform exclusivity. And they do that through their Xbox platform, trying to create cross-platform access to games. And that's at one end of the spectrum. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got like Nintendo as your giant that really wants to keep you in their hardware software ecosystem.
So just in simple terms, then, for those that don't understand, we're talking about the idea that a game is released and it can be played across multiple platforms, whether you've got whatever your console is, or whether you're playing it via the cloud, you can access these games. That's sort of one development, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I think, I think regulation is going to come down and look more closely at things like monetization and consumer protection at that angle, right? So if you've got a lot of these games have microtransactions, pay to win mechanisms, you have to basically download something for free, and then I'm sure anyone out there has got children that's had them download an app will be familiar with them coming to you, say, "Oh, mum or dad, I just need £5 to unlock this feature in the game." There's a lot of focus, I think, there. And then you've got these evergreen topics, obviously, of data privacy and security. And particularly when we come on to talk about cross-border friction, tariffs, and geopolitics, I think there's a big area of focus there as well about what data certain games are collecting on people.
Yeah, and also I think what's interesting will be to see how user-generated content evolves within this sector, because I mean you talked about Roblox, Howard. I mean, we've seen how user-generated content has thrived on platforms like TikTok and Instagram, and whether there is, I mean, my understanding is Roblox is a sort of YouTube for gamers, essentially. So people are going in, creating their own games at relatively low costs, I guess, and people can just play and give feedback, and it sort of works like that, I guess.
Well, yeah, and you mentioned Roblox, and also there's there's games like Minecraft. Earlier I talked about games becoming much more cinematic. Well, this is kind of the other extreme of very blocky, basic graphics, and that hasn't stopped massive user growth in some of these games. You're right. I mean, in terms of something else that we would look at, the power of customers when we were looking in the industry. And if we look at gaming, well, historically it was pretty negligible. I mean, obviously they were the ultimate consumer, but didn't really have kind of very much power. But now games are social communities, and so that they're actually influencing how popular those platforms are as a group. and then clearly we've got AI. We've got, could these social communities be threatened by a flood of AI bots, or will they become much bigger, much more immersive, much more complex? We'll have to wait and see.
Okay, well, let's talk about AI then. So we've talked about how some of the very the really sort of successful franchises, where they have incredibly high development costs and production costs. Is AI going to make that cheaper?
I think there's two AI angles that I think we should talk about. And I think the first one is that one. That's about what impact does this have on the fundamental software engines that drive this business, okay? And the other one, I think, is its impact on humans. So the latter, its impact on humans, I think, is interesting because this industry employs thousands and thousands of people. Many of them are voice actors. Many of them are actors that are used in the game. And if you're into this sector, it wouldn't have passed you by. There's a big strike going on between the SAG-AFTRA, it's the Screen Actors Guild, and the American Federation of Television and Radio Artists, who are on strike because of the AI replication of people's voices in games. So, this directly, there's a lot of action, legal action at the moment that's directly challenging AI replacing human talent in these grand narrative games at one end of the spectrum. But I think at the other end of the spectrum, I think we recognize that a lot of games, even if and I'm into some really niche games as well, like real indie games that are really simple, but they're ultimately built on platforms that have been around for a decade and a half, 2 decades, platforms that were designed for a very different market and a very different ecosystem of games. And I think where AI comes in there is the kind of rigid environments, like anyone that's familiar with the Unreal Engine or Unity, these are kind of the sandboxes that are used to create games and have been for decades. That's probably going to go, and AI is going to allow people just with a text prompt to create characters, NPCs, games themselves. AI, anyone that's played around with AI extensively can very quickly in Python build their own game, and they don't have to be a coder. So I think where we're going to see that proliferate is in that indie niche sort of end of the spectrum, where it's going to be very, very easy to create your own game. And then I think the impact then is at the other end also, where it has a human impact. It just replaces jobs, with people that are involved in the creative content.
Okay. And what about tariffs? Is there going to be an impact potentially on game development through tariffs?
Well, game development's tricky, I would say, to answer. I'm interested in Howard's view if he has one on that. Where I think the immediate impact that I think is coming is console manufacture and fabrication. Okay, that happens in China, that happens in Taiwan. So all of the companies that are in consoles in a big way make them overseas. Peripherals as well, which are a big part of this engine. Peripherals are all of the other things. You might have headsets, you might have keyboards, mouses, actual controllers, things that people buy.
Yeah.
To that end as well. We've mentioned a little bit about geopolitics, and I think when it comes to capturing data and that side of things, I think there's an angle there as well, because some of the biggest games in the world are owned by Tencent, owned by a huge Chinese company, as an example.
Yeah.
So I think the impact of tariffs is probably at the semiconductor level, the console level, and then the geopolitics. Then it sits above all of this, which is just the cross-border nature of these companies and whether they are in or out of an administration's focus.
Okay, Howard, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I thought David put that really well. I mean, I think the initial focus will certainly be on the manufacturer, and the peripherals, as David mentioned, but then we get into tariffs, stroke regulation, and we get to we've seen it with TikTok, and to what extent can governments try and stop these games, particularly as these games are being hosted on the cloud, so there's not really kind of once you've got an internet connection, then you can play a game. To what extent can governments restrict that kind of activity? I guess that's a big uncertainty.
Okay, so we're saying then this sector, there's a lot going on. There's some big names in there, but it's very fragmented. It is interesting, but it's tricky for an investor because things are happening so fast, things are changing so fast. We can make certain assumptions about the impact that AI will have. As David said, he sort of differentiated between the impact on the big games producers and how there could be job losses there. But at the sort of niche, sort of indie user-generated level, it's actually quite exciting because it can make it even easier to create new games and quite sort of incredible games if you're using AI. Tariffs, we'll have to see. And obviously there's an impact there potentially with the hardware that's used. And we're mindful that there's perhaps potentially more regulation coming to the sector, not just all over the world. So I guess it's definitely an interesting sector, but there's a challenge there for investors. To sum up, is that a fair summary?
I think so. I think we've talked a lot about a couple of public traded companies that have they themselves have quite diversified exposure to different parts of interactive entertainment. But then you have the private markets as well. So I think it's very tricky to get exposure without getting into the micro, getting into like individual releases or very focused exposure. Howard, what's your view?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing I would talk about would be AI. I think we've investors over the last couple of weeks have been struggling with the outlook for AI, given the emergence of DeepSeek, and whether the huge amount that's being spent on AI, does that increase barriers to entry for these firms, or does that actually democratize it? Does that enable much more AI to happen, spread across lots more companies? And I think that this will, I guess this industry will see it as other industries will. And so that's the one thing I guess I'm kind of interested to see, will these big content publishers, will they be the only ones who can effectively use AI and then create massive efficiencies and block everybody else out and become even more strong, or will there be, or will their strong market positions crumble as a result? So I guess that's what I'll be looking at.
Okay. Yeah. Final note to you, David.
My final note is, anybody who is a professional, who's very time poor and wants a recommendation of games they can put down within 10 minutes that are strategy type games, just message me on LinkedIn. I'll give you my top 3.
You can give me the list afterwards, David. Thank you. On that note, a reminder that the views expressed in this podcast are not intended to constitute investment advice, are accurate at the time of recording, and are subject to change. Thank you, David and Howard. Thank you for listening. Until next time on Need to Know. Bye for now.